how you can produce something like that and not speak to a single father. It's just incredible.
In part 1, I considered the narrative presented by a recent episode of Channel 4's current affairs series, Dispatches. My conclusion was that while the programme did manage to highlight widespread concerns about the secret nature of the family court system and provide a platform for some parents and their children to speak about their experiences, the narrative presented was extremely one-sided, misleading, sexist, political, and ultimately exploitative towards victims of abuse. Speaking plainly, concerns about court malpractice were presented almost exclusively through the prism of a political perspective that believes a woman presenting as a victim of domestic abuse should be believed unreservedly, whereas a man in similar circumstances should be treated with grave suspicion, as he is most likely a perpetrator of abuse, seeking to exploit the advantages that victim status can bring. It's a perspective that still significantly and tragically informs the Home Office's approach to delivering state-funded service provision to all domestic abuse victims through their strategy to tackle violence against women and girls. So it's not entirely surprising that Channel 4 ended up broadcasting the programme that they did. But then again, given the programme they ended up broadcasting, it's hardly surprising that so many fathers and families impacted by family court judgments and forms of abuse, including parental alienation, felt strong enough to lodge complaints with OFCOM. In part 2, we will consider the ways in which Channel 4 may have specifically breached OFCOM standards, and we will get the opportunity to listen to some of the sort of voices that one might have expected to hear in a balanced discussion about current failings in family courts.
It happens to men too, you know.
Alright, gentlemen, let's do this.
So to begin with, let's consider Section 2 of the Code that seeks to provide adequate protection for members of the public from harm or offence, and states that factual programmes or items or portrayals of factual matters must not materially mislead the audience, and that in applying generally accepted standards, broadcasters must ensure that material which may cause offence is justified by the context. Such material may include discriminatory treatment or language on grounds of sex or marriage and civil partnership. And to understand just how heavily Channel 4 and Candor Productions leaned into the directly sex discriminatory believe all women, suspect all men narrative, consider this quite remarkable observation from my first expert witness, Vincent Mcgovern, the chair of Central and North London branches of Families Need Fathers.
They showed in Dispatches a video that had been filmed by the court said people at Parliament Square. I know because I was there, 26th of October, I think it was 2019, maybe 2018, can't remember now.
Okay.
The headline speakers were among the most renowned child abusers in the UK, as found in court.
Okay,
criminal and civil courts.
Do you want to expand on that aspect?
Well, two of the principal speakers at that event were Victoria Hay and Samantha Baldwin. And they, if you Google them, have been found guilty of horrific child abuse. Simple as that. Drugging children, etc. Jail times. They've done jail. Oh, sorry, one of them did 4 years, I think. Can't remember which one. So these were the people that this was part of Channel 4 Dispatches documentary, as if they had filmed it. As if the court said was respectable professionals with impartial professionalism.
There is absolutely no child protection in the UK. Only child trafficking, child abusing paedophile rings, running amok in every town and city in the UK. The secret family court has passed its sell-by date and is way past reform. The court needs closing and the judges need to be deposed.
The glass blind spots can confirm that Victoria Haig and Samantha Baldwin both spoke at the event in Parliament Square, and that they have been found guilty of child abuse in UK courts. So I reached out to Candor Productions for comment on this revelation, and remarkably, they have yet to so much as acknowledge my request. The coordinator of the Court Said campaign, Natalie Page, who was given the last word in the documentary, was also apparently heavily involved in its making, helping researchers to source the mothers featured in the emotive and compelling case studies. Her involvement and Channel 4's uncritical championing of her campaign and its key messages is just one potential example of how the programme makers may have breached Ofcom's rules around impartiality and accuracy. And our second expert witness is about to highlight some more. Sarah Phillimore is a barrister specialising in family and child protection law. She's also the creator and curator of the Child Protection Resource website, which aims to provide up-to-date information about relevant law and practice and contribute to the wider debate about the child protection system.
What struck me as really bad was the fact that we did not know and were not told what bits were filmed, what bits were acted. I thought that was really poorly done, given it was such an emotive topic, and people screaming and children being removed at midnight. And of course, I've been doing this job for 20 years now. Children don't get removed at midnight unless they're at imminent risk of death. I mean, I don't know what happened in that case, but it is certainly nothing I have ever experienced in 20 years. I mean, if children are removed from families because of alienation, there's a plan. It's usually, say, after school, in the afternoon, and very often it's thwarted, frustrated. The children then run away. This is why these cases are so difficult, and it's hellish for everybody. But that's a product of the fact it's taken probably 5, 6, 7 years to get to that point where removal is considered. So the whole premise of the documentary was flawed. It was to give this impression that, women who dare speak up about violence, that's it, their children are taken from them at midnight. Absolute nonsense.
Sarah's testimony echoes questions highlighted in part 1 from Lucy Reid, family lawyer and the chair of the Transparency Project, concerning the accuracy of the claims relating to the dramatic footage of the midnight police removal that dispatches place so much emphasis upon. And our third expert witness very much also questions the accuracy and impartiality involved in the manner in which that police removal was portrayed. Amongst other things, Liz Archer is an attachment psychologist and family psychotherapist, and she also very much strikes me as representative of the sort of female voices that Candor TV have gone out of their way to completely ignore.
Okay, so to address bias, I really need to kind of just position myself and set a context of what I'm bringing to this.
Yeah.
So I am an alienated mother. I've been alienated from my 2 older sons of my 3 children since 2011. I have experienced coercive control and domestic abuse over the years as a result of that. On top of that, I've retained residence of my younger child, and I have proactively ensured for her best interest that I've co-parented and maintained contact. I've walked a very difficult line. I haven't been through family court. I was advised by my solicitor that because of the ages of my boys, because of the number of difficulties that I'd experienced, that it would be a case potentially needing a Part 25 expert psychologist, and that I would probably be out of time. My sons at that point were 13, 14, and he says, and the cost. So he just advised me to get on with my life. I was a psychotherapist at the time. I also have a background. I'm an ex-policewoman. I have experience of domestic abuse. I'm an ex-victims of crime rape counsellor. I'm an ex-women's aid counsellor supporting women of domestic abuse. I have a complete 360-degree view and appreciation of how difficult families are, and particularly separation and divorce. And in 2017, I started training with UK training before I did US training in reunification therapy. I've done postgraduate training in neuroscience informed the latest attachment to understand complex families. And for 4 years, I was a reunification family working on cases regarding child contact matters in private family law. And I have performed transfers of residence. So I have reunified 20 children over 4 years.
Okay.
And I would just like to say that following the clinical literature, doing the work properly, that all of these children have settled, and the main outcome of these interventions is to ensure, in the best interest of the children, they have a relationship with both parents. That's my absolute bias, if I have one. A lot of the time, when I've been instructed to do a transfer of residence, I have had no input at all with the case. I'm purely there to have provided a therapeutically supported transfer of residence to help the child with that move and to help them settle and to help put a family structure in place for some ongoing work for the reintroduction back of contact. I have never seen or had a case where contact, generally contact's been stopped for a minimum of 2 years, sometimes 3.5, 4 years. To have had 1, 2 expert reports, to have had 1 or 2 interventions prior. And as per the clinical literature, it is always the intervention of last resort. I mean, the court has literally tried everything. I think what's misrepresented in the programme is it says, I think Dr. Barnett says, there's just no research to say that these work. And I would refute that. The key article, Templar et al. 2016, did a meta-review of all of the research on interventions and condensed it down to the 4 or 5, I think, key elements of what should be present. And the key outcome was, for severe parental alienation, the only clinical intervention that was proven to work for the children was the short-term discomfort of a transfer for the long-term gains and benefits. Now, that article informs the CAFCAS Child Impact Assessment Framework on the intervention section. And there are masses through the Association of Family Conciliation Courts, within the literature, within the clinical literature, within the attachment literature, there is evidence of how these family dynamics, how transfers of residence, the harm that's caused, and how you help the children move to a healthier place. We will go to extreme lengths to try and negotiate the easiest and most compassionate way to move the children that causes the least harm and distress. And again, it would only be in a case where that has not been achieved or a collection has been completely blocked that you would need to then, for the court to make an application to the TIP staff, who would then normally delegate to the police to carry out one of those orders. There's plenty of notice, the judgment comes out, there's negotiation, the mother would have known it was planned, it's all pre-planned, pre-informed.
Yeah.
You know, it gave the impression that any transfer of residence occurs like that. Is just not the case.
Yeah.
That's complete misrepresentation.
We don't go out there and collect data, we're creating data.
Such editorial errors could perhaps have, at least in part, been caused by a lack of due diligence or awareness around child safety measures employed by the admittedly secretive family court system. And yet, all 3 of our expert witnesses indicate that the core issue here is one of impartiality, or rather a blatant lack thereof. Something which is perhaps most obviously evidenced by the female-led production team's inability to commit one single father's testimony to the screen.
95% of fathers are the non-resident parent.
Yeah.
Outcomes of the family courts, okay? Yet, they didn't find one father of the 95%, and there's 44 to 48,000 applications every year to the family courts, as Kafka's Ministry of Justice figures. They didn't find one father who was alienated. They didn't find one father whose children were taken from him on holidays, taken from him by the police and brought back to the mother's house because she made allegations against them. They didn't find one father whose child had repeatedly jumped off a balcony, breaking a leg, an ankle and a kneecap to try and escape from an abusive mother.
This is about men and women, mothers and fathers. So to have an entire documentary that doesn't speak to a single father is, I'm just flabbergasted, but clearly they didn't want to do that because it would have detracted from the purity of the narrative that they were pushing.
I think based on their response that they had tried to speak to one father,
Yeah.
I think for the couple of sections it would have taken to actually state that in the programme to reduce bias. But also, if we were to use the narrative of things being rare, what all Channel 4 have actually promoted is that apparently these fathers are rare. They couldn't find any.
Yeah. And that in itself just thinks of bias. So the question is, what went wrong? And how on earth did Channel 4 end up with a production that generated so many complaints? Were they sold a pup by some of the campaigners they worked with? Were they unduly influenced by the highly influential women's lobby who are currently campaigning heavily on selective outcomes in family courts? Or to all extents and purposes, were the programme makers essentially very much part of that same campaign?
I have met Louise Tickle several years ago. I saw exactly what she was about.
And
I have no interest whatsoever in any further meeting with her.
What would your perspective on Louise Tickle be?
I met her outside the family court, and my perspective is based on experience of a couple of conversations with her. She absolutely wants to have the narrative that if men are abusing women, she sees it by making allegations in the family courts, they are guilty of abuse, and that's domestic violence in itself. The very act of making an application in the court to see your children that you're not allowed to see is an act of domestic violence. Comes across from her mindset and position of body in conversation.
Yeah. Okay.
As far as she's concerned, I questioned her this directly. I says, do you believe that every woman in a refuge or goes to the domestic violence agency is telling the truth? She says, broadly, yes. So that's that. That's the mindset.
Yeah.
You're not going to change that. I'm not going to change that.
I recognise Louise Tickle, I think, from previous programmes. I don't know anything about her. If I could make an opinion, when she says, I think it was 2.5 years in making the programme.
Okay.
I found her very passive. I found her, I just wondered if she'd actually done any research, because I've just come to Twitter and I've learned a lot of these facts in just a few weeks, because all of that knowledge is out there, and the research and the surveys that are available. And I was just very disappointed, because I thought, well, if that's 2.5 years work, it didn't really reflect the richness, the context, and the many other layers of information that could have been built into it to have made it actually really hard hitting and powerful. I think she had an amazing opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think she's kind of taken the path of least resistance and maybe followed her own ideological thoughts rather than, I think she really missed an opportunity.
One grain of truth presented by Dispatches involved recent findings by the Court of Appeal, the significance of which I felt may have been over-egged. So I asked Sarah Phillimore for her view on what some have described as a historic appeal case on family courts and violence against women and girls.
Because there was an awful lot, I think, riding for a lot of people on that judgment, and there was definitely a hope that it would effectively demolish the family justice system and reveal it as not fit for purpose, and show that the judges were all incapable of understanding what abuse was. And how do we remedy it? With our training, which you can pay us for. And that was certainly an impression I got from how some people were talking about it. And it was a bit of a damp squib in the end, because the Court of Appeal looked at the cases. I think it was 4 conjoined appeals. 3 of the 4 appeals succeeded. The one that Proudman was involved in didn't, which is a pleasing irony.
Okay, yeah.
But the Court of Appeal said, yeah, look, judges make mistakes. Judges cock it up. It happens. But the practice direction that tells us what to do when we're dealing with allegations of violence and abuse is fit for purpose. The way it's implemented is pretty much usually okay. We've got these horrible examples of cases where it went wrong. But this is what happens when you have a system that is run by human beings. There will be errors, sometimes catastrophic errors. That's why we have an appeal system. It doesn't mean there's an underlying malice or conspiracy or drive to oppress women. Not at all. So I was really pleased. I thought the Court of Appeal did it sensibly. They took it seriously. They looked at the cases hard. They looked at the surrounding principles, and they said, we think the system is fit for purpose. We think judges know abuse and coercive control.
Sarah Phillimore has been working in the family court system for considerably longer than the self-identifying glam feminist barrister Charlotte Proudman, who spoke to Dispatches about the appeal cases. And by the way, as highlighted in a previous episode, this is the very same human rights barrister and junior Cambridge research fellow who once publicly applauded the assault of two men on her college campus.
Say what?
And Sarah also questioned Dr. Proudman's general perception of the prevailing court culture.
There's something very curious going on, because I hear from certain barristers like Proudman, and I hear from a lot of parents, namely women, that these appalling and awful things are a daily occurrence. All I can say is, in 20 years of doing this job, they are not a daily occurrence for me. So we have very different experiences. And I'm intrigued to know why that is. Have I just been lucky? Have they just been incredibly unlucky? Are we both seeing things through a lens of our own prejudice? I don't know. We need more and better research, but the research we're getting is simply self-selecting lived experience from people who aren't challenged about their credibility or the truth of what they're saying. Now, when I started my website in 2014, I made a real effort to talk to people and to say, I'm happy to talk to people. And it was really, really interesting how many people would initiate conversations with me, and they would be incredibly persuasive, charming. They would sound intelligent, and they'd say, this is a miscarriage of justice. It's going to blow your socks off. So I'd say, oh, goodness, send me the papers. I'll look at them. And they'd send me the papers. And there was no miscarriage of justice at all. There was just an incredibly delusional and manipulative approach from the person who was approaching me. And I suppose it's the lies that we tell ourselves are the most dangerous ones, because there's nobody to challenge them. And I don't doubt for a minute that these people were traumatized, unhappy. I don't doubt for a minute that the court system was not helping them. But I don't know. I was full of hope, and it hasn't come to fruition. And I think I was naive, and I didn't understand human psychology, and I didn't understand the power of the narrative and the need to be right that we all have. That's why I check myself. I'm not saying Proudman's a liar. I'm just saying I haven't had her experience, and I'd like to know. I'd like to shadow her maybe for a month and just see what actually she is exposed to, because it's not my experience.
It created a lot of polarisation actually about the argument. So one polarisation was all collections are by the police. Another polarisation was that any transfer completely traumatises the children without any balance, to say that actually these do work very well. There was a polarisation that made this about genders. So it was men against mothers. It doesn't account for mothers like myself, who are a significant proportion of parents that are affected by parental alienation. It completely breaks that down. There is another dichotomy of making it about domestic abuse on one end and parental alienation the other. They are mutually exclusive. Sometimes they're both present in a case, and sometimes it's just domestic abuse, and sometimes it's just parental alienation. Every case is different. And I think that's blurring and blending two concepts which are completely separate.
I suspect that OFCOM may struggle to make a finding in relation to Section 2 of their Code of Practice, or to find it in themselves to acknowledge the blatant sex discrimination that appears to have very much informed the programme's portrayal of fathers in family courts. But given the number of complaints and mounting evidence concerning accuracy and impartiality, it would be quite extraordinary if they fail to fully investigate what appear to be some rather obvious transgressions in Section 5. And it is those victims of parental alienation that Channel 4 have failed most obviously, by providing self-identifying ideologues with an unchallenged opportunity to essentially deny them, and worse still, imply that male victims particularly are most likely perpetrators in disguise.
It exists in the DSM, diagnostic specific mental disorders or whatever. It exists in case law. It's the elephant in the room. Because I always say, if you make an application in the court just to see your children, you're already a victim of parental alienation. Right? Now, I do not support, generally speaking, I do not support dads to make an application for transfer of residence. Right? I don't. But I absolutely believe that children should have right to a proper relationship with both parents and the wider families. That's the bloody law.
Yeah.
But the implementation is a whole different matter. And those domestic violence agencies are terrified of parental alienation gaining more ground. And another huge failing is that Kafka's, for example, until recently, denied the existence of parental alienation, calling it a syndrome. Nobody called it a syndrome that I know of.
I think this is probably a case of semantics.
Okay.
So I think we've chosen the common term of parental alienation so that everybody knows we're all talking about the context of children, the extreme extent who are manipulated or influenced to reject a parent, and that relationship isn't supported. My training, additional training, was with the Overcoming Barriers clinical protocol. It has the largest data set internationally for research and evidence base. And I prefer personally to use resist refuse. And it's on a spectrum. We talk about parental alienation as if it's this thing, as if it's at the most extreme end. And actually, during transitions and separation after divorce, all families will go through some difficulties. Most families settle after a period of time and overcome it. Parenting will always have difficulties over time. Co-parenting will always have difficulties over time. And parental alienation is really on a continuum. And whilst all cases on the outside superficially might look the same, if you're doing a complete analysis, the complexity of each family, the reasons are quite unique. And I'm just a believer, is a problem well defined is a problem half solved. So if you unpick what's the causes within each individual family, then you address the therapeutic support to assist that family. If you read into the history of parental alienation, there's examples of it all the way back through history. It is just a concept of how people deal with transitions and changes. I mean, in my more broader reading, the Standalone charity has done some excellent academic research on adult estrangement, which has influenced government policy, and 54% of estranged adults come from a family that has a pattern of emotional cut-off or estrangement. So a lot of what my training is and what we can see in these families is there is a context or some form of family pattern or intergenerational history of a failure to deal with conflict and or emotional cut-off.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff coming out of America. I mean, this is the problem, because I think when people object to parental alienation, they object to Gardner, who was the original proponent of it. And he does sound frankly insane, but he is not ever cited or relied upon in British courts. He's just not relevant. We look at the behaviour. It just so happens that the behaviour has now got a label attached to it called parental alienation. Some people object because of its origins. And there was, I think, a move about 20 years ago to establish it as a syndrome that people were suffering from. And I do understand our desire to put labels on things. It makes it easier, but it is a waste of time and energy. You look at the behaviour and you ask yourself, how do we get this behaviour to stop? I don't want to waste time saying, well, is it a syndrome? Is it a mental illness? What are the criteria for diagnosis? No. Just, is there a parent who's being denied a relationship with a child? Is there any reason offered for that denial? Right, well, we've got a problem and we need to fix it. So whatever you want to call it, I don't really care. But I think parental alienation has become a hostage to fortune because its origins are a bit murky and I think based in quite a lot of junk science.
Junk science, like the long since debunked Duluth model, that still so significantly informs feminists like Dr. Adrienne Barnett's research. An unproven feminist theory positing that domestic violence is the result of patriarchal ideology in which men are encouraged and expected to control their partners. An unproven feminist theory that essentially eradicates and denies the existence of male victims of abuse. Abuse that can, and increasingly often does, include false allegations, especially when allegations are raised within the family court system. another highly significant side of the story that Dispatches entirely ignored. A good question to ask would be, in the court system, I mean, the allegation was essentially that some fathers will use allegations of parental alienation to, whether it's kind of get back at the mother or to continue abusing. I mean, would you accept that there are false allegations of parental alienation?
Yes.
Yeah. Which, you know.
Oh, absolutely. And there's false denials of domestic violence as well.
Yeah. And that, you know, because to me, that's
a very important point here.
Yeah, go on ahead.
The only one that's extensively government funded is the false allegations by the women against the men.
Yeah.
That is the problem here.
Absolutely. Because to me, you know, that question is sort of, you know, the dogs in the street or the children in the playground would know that human nature is such that if you're going to, you know, kind of game a system, so obviously, you know, it's possible that kind of, you know, both sexes will, you know, throw out allegations.
Yeah.
But the very fact that, I mean, essentially the narrative was there's really no such thing as false allegations unless...
Oh, that's absolutely, that's...
Unless they're parental alienation allegations made
only
by
then
men.
is that a false allegation,
Yeah.
Now, the courts, for all the myriad faults, there are a few decent judges and individuals within the system who have the nerve, when the children are really being distressed or when the mother is totally hostile to contact with the parents, both parents and the wider families, they will sometimes order transfer residence, normally far too late, I might add. The problem there then is, you see, that the children are so poisoned that they cannot then be allowed to see her quite often. The situation has got so bad. That's a failing of the courts, the ridiculous delay before the children are helped.
Crucially, our witnesses also pointed to the ultimate purpose behind the programme's unashamed promotion of cynical and radical feminist perspectives on partner and family abuse.
I know the cases that went to the Court of Appeal on domestic abuse recently, that were appealed to the Court of Appeal. And it is very simple what Dr. Shara Proudman talks about, judges being up to speed with modern training and understanding of domestic abuse and violence and coercive controlling behaviour, which is very simple. You don't look for evidence, you accept what you're told by the woman, believe the woman, the mother.
Yeah.
That's their definition of it, very simply. They don't want a fact finding a fact, which the family courts used to do not too bad, I might add. I mean, Kenzie did enough of them. Which is, of course, you get to a criminal court with, you know, both parties presenting evidence, cross-examination, things like that. Yeah. Contested hearings are very rare in the family courts. But, and don't forget, once again, none of these have been before a criminal court.
Yeah.
They're just in the family court, balance of probabilities. But they don't even want a balance of probabilities test for their preferred candidates. They want no testing of the evidence from the mother.
Just, it's simply, if the allegation's made.
That's right. The allegation's made, that's it. The fact that she's made it is the fact. The fact that the father denies it is proof that he's guilty. But no, Shara Proudman's and others, many others, as far as they're concerned, the mother should never be questioned, which is a joke, absurd, that women are infantile and can't be responsible for their own decisions and statements.
We're in very, very dangerous territory if we're saying that there is a particular group of self-identified victims who can never be challenged, who can never be open to criticism. This is incredibly dangerous.
The one thing that so many people from so many sides of this debate do seem to agree upon is the need for more transparency and an easing of restrictions around what can and can't be said about court proceedings. And yet, ironically, at least for some, Channel 4's irresponsible and ideological-driven approach to investigative journalism presents a compelling argument against the very thing they were calling for.
The pendulum for me has really swung, and I'm going back, I'm afraid, to more secrecy, because if this is what journalists do, I can't trust them, and I don't want them being allowed greater access to intimate secrets about a child and their family life. But I do think I've been very naive when I originally supported opening up the family courts, because I thought once people see the truth, it will all be great. No. People don't care about the truth. They care about their narrative. Yeah. So if we open up the family courts, all that will happen is people will simply ignore what they want to ignore, exaggerate what they want to exaggerate, because what we've got here is preconceived narratives. So I've been naive. I thought people really wanted the truth, would embrace the truth, work with the truth. They don't. So I think opening up the family courts is not going to help at all. And it's going to expose a lot of children to an internet footprint, really horrendous, embarrassing and shameful proportions, which presumably will, they risk that following them around for the rest of their lives. Their mother and father, the fact their mother and father couldn't sort things out is not their fault.
Interestingly, all three of the experts I spoke to agreed with the London Victims Commissioner's concern about the lack of regulation of expert witnesses. But given the extremely political position that she has adopted towards the status of other victims, I do think it is relevant to ask how credible and crucially impartial an expert witness is the Victims Commissioner herself when it comes to complex matters such as parental alienation, domestic abuse and false allegations in family court disputes. So I asked Vincent Mcgovern for his perception of her regard for victims of domestic abuse and family court failings who are not female.
Well, she has publicly stated that with allegations of domestic abuse, the perpetrator should not be allowed to see the children. What they will say is where there's domestic abuse. What they mean is where there's allegations, but they're too smart to say allegations. But that's what it means in effect.
Yeah.
I met with her along with other people, and it's quite a good hour and a half meeting. And some of her researchers had demonstrated that the closer the 50-50 domestic violence was dependent upon the better quality research done by it by various few organizations, independent organizations of any gender. But we knew very well that her meeting us was only a face-saving exercise to say that she'd met with male victims of domestic abuse. That's all that was. And I knew that, but I didn't say that. I engaged properly.
Sure.
And she has now totally come out clearly against fathers being involved in rearing children where there's allegations of domestic abuse, what she calls domestic abuse. It doesn't have to be proven. But this is the twist in the words, you see, the semantics, that they get away so much with. It's a mockery that she should be in that position with that view.
Well, I'm just very interested in Claire Wexman's Twitter profile and as to who she follows, who within the PA lobby, there is evidence that some of those have been trolled. I'm very interested that she follows Natalie Page, and who is presented in the Dispatches programme is an expert on experts, who is actually a troll and is actually not qualified to judge people. I think Claire Waxman, I've spent a lot of time reading about what is the accreditation and regulation and all of this, and you would need an expert on regulation to explain that. So suddenly we have people who are not experts on regulation, not experts on these professions and their various membership body codes of ethics, advertising Claire Waxman and coming up and just throwing terms around, which I don't think she really understands what the problems are. I'm interested, on the other hand, of the other people who call themselves expert from the domestic abuse lobby, and they are neither regulated or accredited with membership bodies, which I just find a little bit hypocritical.
Over the years, the Glass Blind Spot has investigated a number of claims concerning online abuse made by high-profile public figures, and whilst always cognizant of personal perceptions, I'm aware that false abuse allegations are increasingly deployed as a tactic by ideologues seeking to silence or smear people with opposing views. One of the reasons I approached Sarah Phillimore was because she had written about her personal experience of this tactic. So I asked her what she thought about the Commissioner's allegations about abuse, the propagation of extremist beliefs, and my assessment that there was very little evidence in support of her claims.
I personally don't think it's that difficult to tell the abuse. I mean, it's the language they use, the threats they make. If people are swearing at me, threatening me, going on and on, saying things about how old and ugly I am, etc., you're an abusive troll. And I can tell you, I've had as much of that from women as I've had from men. Yeah. So I'm completely gender neutral on that. There's a small minority in both camps who are criminally abusive. Yeah. So that there's no doubt. But then there's also a huge grey area, as you say. If somebody is triggered, finds what somebody has said offensive, then they will say, "You horrible troll, you're trying to abuse me." And other people looking in on the conversation will say, "Not really." That's the problem we've got. And I do think we've all gone a bit mad over lockdown, and people seem to be on a hair trigger, and abuse is, literal violence is seen really by simply disagreeing with somebody is now seen as literal violence. So I think you're right. I think people have different thresholds, and I don't think there's a huge amount of violent, misogynistic men out there in the debate, but there's enough obviously to ruin it for the rest of you. I mean, the same does go for the women, but of course that goes completely unremarked. I've often commented some of the most abusive people I've met are, big names in the domestic abuse sector. And I find that astonishing, that their whole lives is about campaigning about the evils of abuse, but the minute you dare disagree with them, then whoa, some of the nastiest, most threatening behaviour, communicating with anonymous websites set up to dox me was one particular example. And that is, I think, criminal behaviour. Mainly I see people trying to have a conversation and butting heads because everything's so polarised. Everyone's on broadcast mode, essentially. Nobody wants a conversation. That's the other thing I was naive about. I thought, the internet, we'll all be having these great conversations. No, we won't, because people are stuck on broadcast mode. And that's when it gets difficult. And if you carry on trying to get them to engage, then they get more and more frustrated and start calling you abusive. Even though you're not being abusive, you're simply being persistent, but that's seen as, it's such a big mess. But it doesn't help, does it, when you've got people in positions of power and influence like the Victims Commissioner, coming out so decidedly on one side of a polarised narrative. That isn't responsible at all. It's very dangerous.
Predictably, Sarah has personally witnessed accusations directed at her from some of the leading professionals featured in dispatches, including
Adrienne Barnett. She's called me a troll for saying that parental alienation exists. So it's kind of ironic that, the people contributing to that programme are relying on one of the very points I make about the dangers of unregulated experts. But you see, the moment I say something they don't like, I'm a troll, which was the whole point of my blog. So I thought it was rather amusing that I'm described by Proudman as a leading professional, and yet she's blocked my Twitter account. So, I can't be both. I've got to be one or the other. I'm either a leading professional or I'm a horrible troll.
All of which leaves me wondering, and sadly not for the first time, who exactly is it that's really trolling who?
One of the problems and the reasons that they could not get expert witnesses to speak on this matter is due to the trolling. There's a number of websites being set up. A colleague alerted me, and it was through the court said, where he was being trolled on Twitter, trying to identify cases where he had been the expert on to undermine his work. And then, having spoken to other guardians even, I'm aware that solicitors in NIAS have been targeted, and I became aware of 2 other psychologists who have had websites set up criticising their work.
Wow.
So there's a great personal and professional risk in doing this work. And it isn't about unaccredited experts, as portrayed by Claire Waxman. It's actually about experts who, if they give the opinion that one of the parents doesn't like, they actually risk, the personal and professional trolling websites, numerous complaints.
No matter how thin you slice a thing, there will always be 2 sides. And hopefully anyone watching this from whatever personal perspective or political persuasion will have the emotional intelligence and, frankly, common decency to acknowledge that there is significant substance and compelling evidence to be found in the side of the story that Louise Tickle and Channel 4 essentially chose to ignore. By doing so, they have instead consciously or unconsciously preferred to promulgate harmful extremist beliefs peddled by determined propagandists for personal and political profit, simply because in this case, common decency and professional impartiality would only have served to undermine and detract from their preferred narrative about the world. By doing so, by taking advantage of the secret family court system, they have ended up propagating the very evils they profess to challenge. They've exploited victims, endangered children, and ultimately produced a programme that was a monumental waste of a lot of people's time.
I just think it was a very poor example of this continued polarisation of views about the family justice system. I mean, we have a system that isn't working well. Yeah. It can't work well because it's trying to fix problems which are nothing to do with lawyers and the courts. We're looking at adult emotional dysfunction. We're looking at toxic relationships. And once you bring a child into the mix, then it's very, very difficult. And the family courts, I don't think, could ever be designed to deal with this. So we're left with a system which I accept doesn't work and which hurts people and which traumatizes people. But equally, it doesn't help to start spreading this narrative that the family courts are a tool of misogynistic oppression and they give children to violent men. That seemed to be very much the narrative which the Dispatches documentary was pushing. And I was really disappointed because that's the kind of thing I see on social media all the time. I wasn't expecting it from a reputable journalist, a reputable television company. It was a grave disappointment. I think a really missed opportunity because there's an awful lot wrong that people need to be aware of. We need to talk about, we need to try and fix if we can. But we're wasting our time and it's so frustrating. We're wasting our time chasing our tails. I'm wasting my time writing blogs about a nonsense assertion that there's no such thing as parental alienation. It's a tool that violent men use to hide their abuse. I'm sure that happens. I'm sure there are some violent men lying about being alienated. But equally, there are fathers who've been found to be blameless after court hearings, who leave the court in tears, knowing they will never see their children again, until their children are adults and seek them out. So I find it frustrating because it's wasting all of our time. And of course, the ones who lose, as they always do, are the children. It could have been a brilliant programme, an award-winning programme, if it had just even tried to grapple with some of the complexities that you've hinted at. So wasted opportunities all round and wasting our time, isn't it? Because here we are discussing what's wrong with a documentary. We went, what a waste of time.
It happens to men.
Do you want a point? It happens to men as well. Oh, yeah, okay.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
The Glass Blind Spot is brought to you by you, because it's your views, your likes and your comments that keep this show on the road.